Okay, good morning, everybody. If other people join us, we'll let them in, but to not use too much of your time on a Friday without some content, we'll start our meeting. Last time we talked, we went through a lot of different things, and the message was sort of clear that we should break things down and that we should take things one at a time so that it would be more easy to digest and to consider. So we'll start by looking at that diagram that it seems last time appealed to people, with the blue boxes are what the business side needs to do before we start making decisions about technology, before we start purchasing or configuring or anything like that. And these are the three boxes, defining the requirements for data collection, for analytics, and for decision support. Those are three areas that will provide a foundation for the work related to technology that we would engage later on. So that's what I was hoping that we could accomplish today, and go through some questions that would be used in a facilitated session. It's not a survey, as a guidance in facilitated sessions to help us figure out what the requirements are for these three different things. So we'll start with the business process and performance management. And the idea was that we would focus our assessment of technology with respect to a certain business process or a function, rather than trying to make a judgment make a judgment about whether a utility has certain capabilities. We would divide it to focus on specific processes, whether it's which is what technology is supposed to facilitate or execute. So the first component, the first set of assessment that we would do relates to how we manage these business processes and what we're trying to do. So the questions that we're going to discuss today and get your input on these questions are really related to the scope and complexity and the impact of the project that we have selected, so we know what we're wrestling with, how much level of knowledge, which is how much we actually know about this process, because if we don't know about the process, automating it or improving it would be just more difficult. And then also figure out, how do we measure success of this business process? How do we know that we're doing well? And how are these measurements used for management and improvement? So the scope of the next four questions, and again, it's not a survey, it's something that would be discussed in facilitated session with a whiteboard, would really be about these four things when it comes to the business we're trying to support. So
Cello, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think this really makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of focusing on the business process here. So I'm wondering, so you are going through the steps, scope, and level of knowledge. Would it make sense to also have a goals and objectives for what we are trying to accomplish?
Yes,
I think we have it at the measurement and performance, but I'm wondering if that should be elevated on the top and understanding what are we trying to resolve here.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it will be somewhere in here, but we will, I think it is, under the business needs, the second part of it. So I can go forward to double check.
But that's an example, Ting, of
yes.
the exact kind of feedback that is desired, so that we do tailor this up. And if we're underrepresenting, what the purpose is and why we're doing this, after we get through it, then we can certainly modify or change some focus. But maybe we just get through the questions and then come back to that.
So right now, the business goals and the type of decision support that's needed and how the needs and goals are sort of covered under this second thing. So we're going to get to it, but we will fix it if it, we will fix it and we can move it. All that is, totally makes sense. So this first question is just to figure out who's impacted and who's included in this business process, just to get a sense of what is it that we're trying to address. Because it's one thing if we're trying to address, what level are we on? Are we dealing with something that just individuals do, like they calibrate an instrument or they collect samples? Or are we looking at a business process that several people within a team are working on, like construction inspection, processing water quality samples? Or we're talking about a process that involves more than one team. For example, within a department, like review engineering design deliverables or preparing water quality regulatory compliance reports, which would typically be either in engineering or in water quality? Or are we talking about a business process that includes staff and management from different departments, such as CIP planning, which includes engineering and finance and operations or asset management? Or if we're talking about something that is really on the organization-wide level, such as decisions made by upper management and executives, which is developing policies, defining KPIs, and so forth. And the reason for this question is to just get a handle about what it is that we're dealing with. What are we trying to work with? And also, in some ways, what are our risks? Because there are risks inherent in each of these levels, but it's just a different kind of risk. So it's just to kind of get oriented whether, what it is that we're trying to improve. So I'm going to stop here and see if this makes any sense to you. If you have any ideas on how to improve this, or if you think that this would not be useful information, maybe you can either put it in the chat line or you can just raise your hand. Yvonne, what do you think? You think this looks okay?
Oh, I was actually just thinking more about Ting's question and trying to think if I could think of a resource that sometimes, like the words goals and objectives and KPIs, like those things all get mushed up together and people use that term to mean the same thing. And so anyway, I was just Googling around trying to see if I could find a good resource that helps clarify those things that you could use. But so I was doing that.
Okay, it's okay. You were doing research. Right?
That's right.
So does this, do you think this would be helpful in trying to see, because when, what is it that we're actually dealing with? Because it's a different level of anxiety, if you will, if you're dealing with, more and more people involved.
Yes.
Yvonne,
more people cross and up, I guess.
Yeah. Yvonne, I would also throw in, and for everybody's consideration, that this applies to technology that's to enable the business process, but it's also, this is of use to all the other business processes that people are working with in their improvement areas, even if they're not working with technology right now.
That's
so
right.
so I think that you and this team, it's a really valuable to just think of, okay, we're going to be improving a business process, and these are these areas we're covering today, if Cello can get through it, is really deals with the context, and you want to make sure that purpose is in there, like Ting said, but you're dealing with scope and the other aspects that Cello's going through.
Yeah, because some people have mentioned, that they're working on procurement, and as you know, procurement includes different people. So I think, we just have to kind of get a sense of what is it, how big is the bear that we're wrestling,
Yes. How complex?
Yeah, exactly.
What are you taking on? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So the next two questions are, this one and the next one is, how much do we actually know about this process? Because if we're going to go improve a process, it would be useful to know something about it. How are we doing this? And this is really taken from CMMI maturity capability levels that they establish. So whether the knowledge about what's actually, how to do this process is maybe in people's and individuals' heads, so the person who calibrates the meter just knows how to do it. Or if it's a team that knows how to do it, and it's kind of, there's some cross training, or there are standard operating procedures, or there are business process models, or business process models that include metrics, KPIs, can be used for simulation, analysis, improvement. So just so we see where we are on the maturity scale in terms of capability maturity scale for how much do we know about what we're trying to improve. So if we're going to try to improve procurement, how much do we know about it? So on this question, this is something that is actually a lead-in to the follow-up question that is a lot more specific. Because in the follow-up question, we'll say, do you know who the stakeholders are? The documentation that you have, does it tell you who are the stakeholders that are involved? Does it tell you which business units are involved? What the activities and workflows are? What are the decisions and logic for sequence of activities? Data required for each activity, technologies and systems that support these different activities, roles and responsibilities, resources that are required like staff, equipment, time that it takes to complete each activity, artifacts that are inputs and that are generated, metrics, how you're going to measure this process, and metrics that may be impacted because this process, let's say that that it's something about assessing condition assessment. If it's a process for condition assessment and it's in maintenance department, but it actually impacts other teams and groups in design and operations and stuff like that. So this would give us a more granular answer to the first questions, and it would also be done in a facilitated session. We would, people would sit around, because if you define the first, you have the scope of the process, and then if you don't know these things, then application of technology or even addressing people issues becomes more difficult because you simply don't know who's even involved.
So Cello, I think you mentioned the word maturity, and maybe this is obvious to everybody, but maybe not, is that as you're going through these questions in this facilitated workshop, there is a maturity scale that would be applied to each of these so that you can determine where your gaps are.
Exactly. And then if we're thinking about the risk, this is almost, if the first question tells us that this is a big process with many people involved, and this question tells us that we have very little documentation about it, all of a sudden, how we look at that improvement process, it tells us, this is this is a little bit more risky and a little bit more dangerous because you don't have documentation about what you're doing now, and you don't have a foundation for designing something, whether it's technology or business process improvement, that would provide the foundation for these improvements. Does this make any sense? Tinglu, what do you think?
It does. Cello, I think this is a good to look into roles and responsibilities. It reminds me like a RACI chart almost like.
Well, yes, RACI chart is something that I have considered, and I'm going to write it down. We can certainly add it because, you know, we could ask, do you have a RACI, you know, a chart, a responsibility matrix? I wrote it down in the notes.
Yeah, you might also consider Cello for some of the references and the resource for the utilities there too, because I think this is a very comprehensive. Every time I ask you a question, Cello, you already said, we already addressed that is somewhere in the document or presentation. But I also want to just be mindful of the utilities of people looking through that. Some of the things we can put it more as a resource if they want to use it, guide them rather than having everything as a project document here. Something to think about.
So Ting, that's really good. And Mike Barnett hasn't chimed in here, but one thing that will happen with this is that it's also, this itself is a business process. And in this business process that we're designing, it does have the activities and the questions, the source of data and the decisions. It also has the roles and responsibilities. I mean, it basically swim lanes for each of the different roles associated with it. So there's an opportunity, you know, when we get all through this, this is an assessment, but when you get into looking at, okay, now what do we do with the assessment and how do we improve and stuff, roles and responsibilities fit into that as well. So, you know, we'll need to reconcile how a RACI chart relates to the business process itself that we're designing.
Yeah.
Mike, you're on mute. Mike, you're
Thanks, Cello. Thanks, Cello. Just an aside on that, when you do the business process modeling, the swim lanes that Cello's shown in his diagrams are the responsible party. And then there's another concept called additional participant that you model when you're building your business process models that can be tagged with different RACI, you know, components. Maybe they're consulted. And then some of the tools that you have, the one that we're using for the WISE project or program, will actually go through the models and then build the RACI chart for you. So it's kind of nice that to view that RACI chart and then see, you know, how you can do all sorts of human resource management work resulting from that.
So this first section was not that complex, and it's just really about getting a handle how, you know, how challenge, you know, trying to size up the challenge that we're trying to address. So the second question is about the business needs. What kind of decision support do we need? Are business goals defined and documented, and how is performance on needs and goals measured? Because unless we have this in place, how will we know? How will we know whether, you know, how much technology is helping? Are we getting some technology without having a clear idea what our business needs are? So I'm going to also stop. Charlie, so far, does it make sense to you what we're doing?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Ting, your earlier comment about business goals, you can see that those are included here. It's almost like, what are your functional requirements? But we could introduce another question that relates to the organization-wide goals. Have the organization-wide goals been considered, or something like that? I mean, think about that, and if you think an additional question should be added.
Yeah, I like this. God, I still think about the sequencing, so we can go through this and how to guide the utilities step by step. But I think the content are all there.
Okay, so the first thing with the business needs is we're trying to ask what kind of category of decision support do you need currently, and what do you anticipate you may need in the future? So the question would be, do you need, and the three types of analytics that we have defined, or not, we didn't define this, these are kind of classes of analytics. One is just reporting on what happened. The second one is predictive analytics that has some models in them and say what will or what could happen. And the third one is how do you make it happen, which includes automation. So are we trying to automate something? Are we trying to just give people reports on what has happened? And are we just trying to have some tools to tell people, okay, if you do this, if you do this capital program, what is it going to do to your rates or whatever, something like that.
Cello, since I'm going to be proactive before you calling my name here.
Good. I was just about to do that.
So I think the three categories are good. One scenario I could think about for utilities, this is a journey, right? It's you start with the descriptive analytics for people to understand, but the long term you want to get to predictive and a prescriptive analysis. So when we consider this business process, what is the time or duration we're considering? That short term, long term, or things where it's more both focus on more on a specific project there?
That's a really good question, and this is something that was intended. If we can visualize that we did the business process model, we found out who's involved, we found out how they do things, what stuff they generate, whether it's data or impact or whatever. And then we get them into a room and we start a discussion about this. So it was really not envisioned that they would just answer these questions, but that they would, and this would be described in the guidelines, and say, people might say, okay, we need reporting on this, but we need predictions on something else, and we need to automate the third thing. So that it is really to get how should I say, to get folks to different stakeholders to discuss and create a map, and then they could do exactly what you are saying, that they decide, okay, we currently in the short term we want to do this, but in the long term we're interested in this. So my own background is like control systems, and Pat Boyle just made an excellent comment, because she said people want to go to prescriptive or automation and they skip everything else. But what happens, like in operational situations, is something is automated and you haven't figured out how you're going to run this manually properly, and then you lose internet, and then you lose a network connection, or you lose some part of technology, and then you're really in the sauce. So to have a map and have people consider these three things, I think, and then say, okay, and create a scope, schedule, and a budget for this, that would be the purpose, but not, again, it's not the purpose for people to just to answer no, maybe, and yes, but just to kind of create a roadmap for how they want to get to these different capabilities. So the actual matrix or table could look a lot different. It could be on flip charts, you know, and it could be for different parts. You know, we can automate this part when we want, or we want to have these types of reports and apply these three different types of decision support in different places in the business process. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah, what you said, it makes perfect sense, Cello. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these. These are really excellent questions and great comment from Pat. So the next thing is that once they create these, once they have a map like this, then they would only work with the stuff where they said, yeah, we're interested in that. And then they would say, how are we doing this today? And then they would select from these different levels, again, which are really different levels of maturity, what Scott keeps, pointing to, of where we are now. So for example, the business needs for this level of analytics have not been defined. We don't have requirements for this. Maybe do you want to kind of do it, but you don't really have business requirements. Then, okay, we have thought about it. We started on it all the way to level 5, which is, okay, we have it defined, documented. It includes alignment of the performance metrics for these activities within this process and the overall KPIs to just get a sense where you start your journey. Because, and then, so the way we're building is, let's say that it's a very complex process that we started with. And then we said, okay, we have very little documentation. And then they say, and then here you say where you are, so that the plans that we have for how are you going to go forward, they don't miss a step. And then we don't start building the second story before we even built the foundation for making rational decisions about purchasing technologies and stuff like that. Does that resonate? I'm going to have to call on Yvonne again.
I see. We all see your approach for engagement. It's like be called on. Yeah, and I mean the whole thing makes sense to me. So, I mean, I'm on board.
Okay.
I just am like, how do you communicate this? So I don't know if I'm going to have any more comments about it. It's just more how do you communicate this with and do this?
Is it getting a little bit more clear about if it's done in meetings and we explain the background and we know who the stakeholders are? And I think in my own experience, one of the things that's helpful is, especially if the process includes 3 or 4 like departments or different business units, they're not always aware of the whole process. They kind of know their part. And it's when we get them in the room and we say, okay, well, yeah, but because they lose sight that internally they also have customers, that each of the business units has some customers even internally. So that's how this, would kind of work in a facilitated session. So it's not a survey, it's just a structure for learning what technology needs to do. Pat, any thoughts?
Well, the one thing that keeps running through my head is that you might have a person in a process that whenever the bell goes off, he has to push the button, but he doesn't know why he pushes the button, but the manager might know why he pushes the button. So that's why it's important to get everybody involved in the process. Yeah.
Well, I recently, a couple of years ago, we were working on a project at the water district, and we had a 4 months delay on the project because we had to go through this procedure to get consultants access to our network. So I asked one of my engineers, just map out what does it take, who is involved, and it was unbelievable. It barely fit on an 11 by 17. So when we got people in the room to look at this, they all said this doesn't make any sense. But before that, people in HR only knew that they received this form and that they have to do this with the form and then it goes someplace else. And it was very helpful for them to all realize, oh, okay, well, so because otherwise they just get focused on their own thing and they don't really get an appreciation of what this whole thing is all about. And if it's also this kind of thing will hopefully help get people start building more of a team approach and get people to understand what the purpose of the whole thing is. Scott, you're on mute.
Going back to Yvonne's question, she doesn't realize it yet, but she's going to actually be very expert and she's going to feel extremely comfortable with all of this in the end. But if you imagine that in what we call a value model for the entire utility, it's made up of all these different processes, and this is a methodology that can apply to any of those processes. But like Cello says, if you basically get people, if you use a standard methodology, and then you get people in the room, the stakeholders that are impacted by a certain process, then you just workshop this and work your way through it. We haven't even gotten to technology, but the these higher level questions, context questions, can apply to any business process, regardless of whether you're trying to improve at the moment technology. It's going to come up in this process, but it may not be the purpose of why you're doing it. But actually, it is something that after there's some redundancy going on here that you would become pretty expert in it. And if you have somebody in your organization who kind of specializes in this, and maybe we'd hear from some others. I know Deb is on the line, and Charlie and some others that maybe they'd want to chime in here as well.
Deb?
I'm afraid I don't have much to say at the moment because I was not listening really hard. Sorry.
It's okay.
So can you just ask the question again? Because we're working on the business process. We're working on learning the business, the BPMN.2.0, getting more people involved so we can do this, especially with the fact that we're trying to get a new EAM system. So we're going to use this process to help us determine high-level business process and business processes than requirements.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think this would apply, like Scott says, to different aspects and different business processes. So that makes sense. That makes sense. And Yvonne agrees. Yvonne agrees as well. So let's see. Go back to so this is sort of a question about the goals. And so just try to get a handle on what we're trying to accomplish, because we're going to try to make some sort of an improvement. But this is just a list of goals, and you can see that, again, that it says they're extra boxes, which means that if this is in a workshop setting, then we could start with these different things and just see what is important for us, whether it's reducing the costs or it's reducing the staff time, better decisions, streamline or automate, improve, reduce risks, facilitate collaboration between different people, just to get a sense of how, and again, it's not a survey, it's a framework, a structure for a discussion so that people can say, well, we got to meet this thing, we have to meet permit limits, and I'm not really, I'm not really going to try to save energy, and I'm not, I want to make sure that we don't that we're in compliance, or somebody could say, well, you know, we really need to get this cost under control. My old advisor, when I was working, you know, on my degree years ago, said, well, the first thing is you have to keep the plant running, you know, then you meet the permit limits. Then you can think about optimizing and improving and saving energy and stuff like that. So just to get a handle, you know, what are the business goals that we're shooting for here and how are they important? So we get a map in our head, you know, what we're striving for. So Ting, does this make sense to you? Because you brought you brought up the goals before. If you see anything that we could improve here, you know.
Yeah, I was looking at this list. It's very comprehensive. I couldn't think of anything else. And you also have the extra boxes there I like. So people can put it in, because so many things, like my work is mainly related to technology requests in the work, which is similar to process. And a lot of times we jumped into the technology immediately without identifying fully about what are all the business goals here. So I see there might be some multiple choices too that people can leverage process and technology to support multiple goals here. And well, I guess the other thing you could even think about the utilities overall goals, like stakeholder engagement and other things. So
absolutely. So the idea was to have, you know, a few of these kind of things, and then for people to add, and we can add the one that you just mentioned, so that because like if somebody is, let's say, a technology person, it would be all this stuff that we've gone through, although it has nothing to do with technology really, would be very helpful to know who's involved and what am I trying to improve? What do they have right now? What's documented? What's not documented? Because without having, when people go and apply apply technology without knowing these things, the risk, I believe, would be much greater.
yeah, and then you end up with optimizing a smaller kind of a technology request versus achieving the overall goals. I see you are here as bridging the gaps and the translating between the business functionalities to the technology requirement and the process requirement here.
Yeah, so anyway, so that's, you know, we're going kind of step by step. So these workshops would then be really, and this doesn't have to be like 50 workshops, you know, just to start getting everybody in the room, start talking about the process. What do we need? What are our goals? What, you know, how are we going to know that we're successful? So, you know, those are the questions that set that up. Now, once
I like the fact that you guys are actually asking questions to make people slow down a minute and think through what they're actually trying to get to, right? That's where we all, I know from experience here, that we get off on a racehorse and we should have had a greyhound or something, but you know, we never have, we got to ask enough questions up front to know where we're driving to, right?
Yes. So then,
I think having it formatted, you're driving that process.
Exactly.
So appreciate you and Scott and doing that.
So once that page says, okay, these are our goals, then we ask them, okay, and then you can structure the next, you know, you go around the goals that are like important, you know, or critically important, and then you go one by one, and I say, okay, how do you measure these things? Do you have a way to measure the costs? Because then you'll say the metrics for this goal, and this is the maturity of you being able to monitor and your performance. Metrics have not been formally defined all the way are documented, measured, evaluated, periodical, used in KPIs and stuff like that. So then we can see, okay, these are your goals. Do you know how to measure them? Because otherwise, how are you going to know if you're successful? So I think this was, so the list of goals on the left column you could start with the ones that have been marked as, you know, somewhat important and or very important and stuff like that. If something's not important, probably doesn't need to be, you know, included on the list. So anyway, so does this make sense?
Yes, I love, can I just say, I love Pat's suggestion, and which, and could we maybe consider it for the format of these meetings? Because I guess I'm still struggling with, like, you're reading it to us and then asking us, what do we think? But
Okay.
I feel like it'd be better if we were just doing it, you know, and then
Okay.
we would actually like come up with like, how long did that take us to do that? I mean, and with something, because I think the biggest thing for me is like time, like how much time will this take? Because I have to get people to be convinced that this is a good idea. And right now, I have no idea how long this is going to take.
Okay, so in order to do this and actually have a, you know, a dry run or a practice, we would kind of have to, you know, Pat suggested making a peanut butter sandwich. If we can choose, we can either do something, you know, a little bit like that, or we can take a look at, we have a number of case studies on different business processes that we already have the models, you know, so we could just pick one of those things and go through and then you know, kind of simulate a discussion. You know, somebody could play a person from operations or a person from engineering or IT or whatever. That'd be great. I mean, if we could have sort of what you're thinking would be actually kind of a really hands-on training of how to do this. Am I getting that right, Yvonne, or no?
Well, I'm just thinking like, I just still struggle with the fact that this is like already done. So like, what is our contribution? So if our contribution is right now, it's like, what do you think about it? What do you think about it? Versus if we were doing it, like we would really run into like, oh, well, that doesn't sound, it doesn't work. Or, you know what I mean? Like
I understand.
or this, yes, this is, I just think you would get better, genuine feedback from us, and we practically understand how long does this take to do, and we would then also have experience doing it.
Okay.
I just throw that out there because otherwise I don't know. Otherwise I could just read this, you know, and I actually have. I mean, sorry, just to be super.
Well, no, there's a book by a couple of authors. One is Markova, the second one I can't remember. It's called Collaborative Intelligence, and they go into how people into learning styles. For example, some people can learn when they hear things. Some people need to see diagrams and schematics, and some people really prefer to actually do it. And they say that training that is that the best training addresses all three of these aspects. And this one, what we're doing today, does not, because we're not actually doing it. So I think it's a great idea. I don't know quite how to organize this yet, and I don't want to kind of think on my feet to say, okay, this is how we're going to go about it. But this is a food for thought and a very good suggestion for us to structure this to actually go together for this team to go through the process of actually, you know, having such sessions and you know, breaking it down like that. I don't think that this needs to be, you know, 50 workshops or anything like that. I think that some of these things can be combined. Not each. We don't need to have a workshop for each one of these things. You know, we could have a workshop that covers all the things that I've gone through so far in a single workshop, if it's, you know, maybe like a couple of hours. But it also depends on that first part of, like, how many stakeholders do you have? How big is this thing? How complex it is? And the purpose for that front part is to know, okay, how exactly are you going to organize your approach to, you know, to learning and to defining these things? You're on mute.
Sorry. So, I mean, if we at least knew, like, it takes this long for the peanut butter sandwich process, or one that you already have that's obviously gonna be a little more complex, then that's good information, you know. And then if you have something that is many more departments, and then you can anticipate that, you know, you're gonna have more hours, significantly more hours to do all of this. But
Okay. So,
and I mean, it just comes from like a practical, like, I want it to be useful. But I'm cognizant, like, in my own organizations, like, me having a meeting that's over an hour is, like, very objectionable. So I mean, I really have to have a good pitch and plan for who I'm going to involve and how much time I'm asking them for. And right now I don't know. I mean, I know all these slides and they got great content, but I don't know how much time it would take. So.
Okay.
Okay, food for thought. Like, we can keep going for today, but yeah.
Yeah. So let me think about that. This is gonna be my homework, to figure out how to actually have almost you know, how to make these things into a hands-on experience, and how to actually apply this. I will think about it, and we can hopefully have some idea about that before the next meeting. If I understand correctly, let me just see. I don't know how many. That's pretty much, that was the last slide. So let me think about that, and I will. And I may ping Pat on her peanut butter sandwich idea to see if I'm trying to figure out how abstract can it be, you know, this kind of exercise, and whether it needs to be really an actual process from a water sector utility, or can it be something like you know, a peanut butter sandwich.
How about, Cello? How about we, as an audience here, we think about some of the readily could be applied using your process, and think about some project, and then send it to your way, and then you can give you some ideas what we are trying to accomplish, and then you can think through, and then we can having some activity design, like what Pat and Yvonne, yeah, thanks, is saying here, because I think what you're looking for is what are the case studies, right? What are the project we can apply your model, but we're from a utility standpoint, we're kind of still having questions of how practical this is, and getting just understanding the whole breadth of it before we can even provide more meaningful feedbacks.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and it would be extremely helpful if you guys could send me an email and say, okay, this is you know, it should be something that's not hugely complex, and also not so simple that we can't you know, it has to be on the right kind of scale, not horribly complicated and not trivial. So, and I can probably make even the peanut butter sandwich complicated, but it would be very useful to get ideas from you, and also the other folks who didn't join the meeting today. I can follow up with an email and let them know what we would try to do. Any other?
Have you even thought about the supply chain disruptions to peanut processing, farming?
It's a good idea, and I may ping you, Pat, just to have a one-on-one conversation, maybe to bet, because we're running out of time, to better understand your idea. And the nice part is if we pick something generic like a peanut butter sandwich, it would really be useful. It'll be actually very useful because it would be something that we could make part of the guidelines and the training materials.
I'll be honest, I walked around with your intelligent water system flow chart for the past 2 weeks and tried to figure out how different projects I'm working on fit into it. And one of the projects I'm working on right now with my climate change work group, and it fit in very nicely, so I'm picking pieces from it to use.
Great. So yeah, it's a wonderful suggestion to attain to you know, collect ideas on this. So if you could, if you guys could send something our way, Scott and I will have. I think we lost Scott. He had to go catch his plane. Scott and I will work on preparing for our next call.
Will do.
Okay. Any other thoughts before we close it up? Okay. Well, thank you very much, you know, for your time, and your comments are really very helpful, and they will really improve the, you know, product at the end. And I understand, Yvonne, you know, I thought it would be good to have a straw man to start with that we can criticize and change rather than start from scratch. But I didn't mean to imply that this is like the only way to go about it, you know?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks very much, everybody, and we will